Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Lots happened since last Tuesday. If you remember, last Tuesday, while we were giving the shir, the American election was going on, and we offered a tefillah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that whatever the result would be, it would be good for Klal Yisrael, and let's hope that that is indeed the case. Also, since then, I've had a haircut, which was quite an experience for me because I haven't seen my hairdresser for 2 months. He's been locked down. I have a feeling that when he saw me, he got carried away a little bit. And as a result, I feel a bit fleeced. I feel a bit like a shorn sheep. But I'm pretty sure that will rectify itself shortly. Humor aside for a moment, one of the, of course, saddest things that has happened since we've met last is the patira of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichron Livracha. It's hard to believe, really, that he's no longer with us. For many of us in the UK and around the world, he was so much part of our lives. And for me personally, he's been a good friend of mine for 40 years. I believe the shul is doing a commemorative event on Sunday evening, at which I will give a brief hesped and speak a little bit more about him. But I'm sure you're all aware that he was really one of the really powerful Torah voices of our generation. And he had a unique voice which reached many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. I don't know of any other of my rabbinic colleagues, actually, about whom I could say confidently they have a worldwide audience. Rabbi Sachs really reached the English-speaking world wherever it is, and his loss is very painful and a big loss for all of us. Fortunately, he wrote a lot, about 30 books, and he left a legacy of ideas and texts, in addition to many hundreds of videos and recorded interviews and talks. So his ideas and thoughts will continue to inspire people, but we feel his loss very much. But as I say, I'll speak more about him, please God, on Sunday evening. Somebody else passed away who we maybe don't know so much about because he was an extremely modest man, Rabbi David Feinstein, who's really been the posek of New York since his father of Moshe Feinstein passed away. And because he was so incredibly modest, spoke modestly, dressed modestly, was not a public figure in any way, he was never really a headline personality, and most people don't know about him, but actually he has been an extremely important Talmud Chacham and guide for many hundreds of thousands of people. So we are a little bit more, we're a little bit bereaved over this last week. And I must be honest with you, I do feel it. I do feel the sadness, particularly Rabbi Sachs, who's a very close friend of mine. We discussed lots of things together, and in fact, I can share with you that a few years ago, when I hadn't yet decided to come on Aliyah, I was thinking about coming on Aliyah, and I went to discuss it with Rabbi Sachs in his house in Golders Green. We sat together over a cup of tea for quite a long time, and I'm mentioning it because I think he possibly had a little bit of an intimation about his own medical health situation, and I said to him, look, I'm thinking about coming on Aliyah, and Eretz Yisrael is so important to me, and my connection to Israel is really in my heart and soul. And on the other hand, I'm leaving my community and all my Talmidim in London. And he said to me a line like this. He said, look, I could have stayed on as chief rabbi, he said to me. At 65, I could have stayed on, but I decided not to. I decided that there were books I wanted to read and audiences I wanted to reach, which I couldn't do as a chief rabbi. And because it was important to me, I decided to call it a day with the chief rabbinate and do what I really felt was important. He says, because I feel that if you really want to do something important in life, you have to do it sooner rather than later, because you don't know how long you've got. That line, and what he was saying to me was, if Israel's really important to you, do it sooner rather than later. Don't delay it too long. If you have a chance to go, you have a window of opportunity, you have a wonderful successor and in place, and the opportunity to live in Israel. Do it sooner rather than later. And I had a feeling, he didn't spell it out because he was a very intensely private individual in many ways, but certainly from the way he spoke, I got the feeling that he felt that he didn't have as long to live maybe as he would have wanted, and therefore he had a sense of urgency about him, and that was his advice to me. So as you know, I followed that line of thinking, which was anyhow echoed my own thinking very much as well. If you do want to do something important to you, do it soon. Don't delay it. Chazal say, mitzvah habol yodcho al tachmitzeno, right? The dough can become chametz in one moment if you leave it too long, and so you can miss the moment, and therefore it's important to do what's important to you now rather than later on. Okay, that's just a very small anecdote. I've got hundreds of anecdotes with the chief rabbi, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, but he was certainly in his life and in his dignity and in his Torah and in his representation to the wider world, he was a real Kiddush Hashem at so many different levels. And I'll speak more a bit about that on Sunday evening. I see Henry Israel is now with me. I've been speaking to Henry on the phone about the Sunday night event. That's going ahead, is it right? Yes, that's going ahead. And so you'll be seeing more of me on Sunday evening, more on that topic. So what our series at the moment is called Themes in Sefer Bereishit. So I was thinking, even though I don't plan, as I say, to dedicate this whole shia to recollections and hespedim about Rabbi Sachs, what I thought I'd do is take a chapter out of one of his books and share it with you and go through it together, because there is a chapter in one of his books which is really a beautifully described theme in Sefer Bereishit. He takes Sefer Bereishit and he looks at it with his own unique perspective, which is sort of seeing the big picture, seeing large themes, and connecting it also to secular studies and secular ideas. Just to remind you, last week we had a look also at Sefer Bereishit in terms of a broader theme. I learnt with you the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Tana Debei Eliyahu, about how the first 2,000 years were tohu vavohu. The first 2,000 years of mankind, counting from Adam and Chava, were spiritually disastrous, chaotic. Right, the world was spiritually in entropy, falling apart, and the second 2,000 years began a process of Torah, meaning what? That the world suddenly was beginning to have a meaning and a purpose and a direction. And the Gemara there asked the question, what happened in the year 2000? Right, we're now in 5781, but the year 2000 was clearly a watershed, was a changing moment, to which the Gemara answers that in the year 2000, Avraham Avinu was 52 years old. He was born in 1948. He was 52 years old, and at that point he started doing what? He started teaching emunah and chesed to anyone he could find. Wherever he went, he was teaching emunah and chesed, and that was his message to the world. Clearly also teaching the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the Noachide laws, and Avraham became the first teacher. He wasn't the first ma'amin. Noach was a ma'amin. Noach had emunah, and so did Shem, and so did Chanoch, and so did Adam and Chava, but they weren't teachers. He was the first teacher, and by becoming the first teacher, that was the first moment which laid the foundations for what would later on, 500 years later, be Matan Torah and the whole process of Torah learning and teaching. So that's what, just giving you a brief synopsis of the idea that we ended with last week. I'd like to maybe have a look at these parshas through the eyes of Rabbi Sachs as it appears in this book. An interesting book. If anybody's, I don't expect you all to have read all 30 volumes of his book, all 30 volumes that he's read, that he's written, and some of them are indeed very, very complicated, some of his books. This one is moderately complicated. I do remember, actually, Rabbi Sachs had a very interesting sort of angle on humor, and the British self-deprecating humor particularly. And I remember once when he got up to speak, and he spoke about the book that he just recently published. And he said, I went to visit my mother recently, and as I walked in, she said to me, Jonathan, when are you going to write a book that I can understand? And he was like apologizing to the general public that some of his books maybe are a little bit too densely philosophical or academic. As you know, academics always aim for maximum unreadability, and he grew up in that tradition in Cambridge. That goal is to write things which are unreadable. That's considered a virtue among academics. And when he shifted from the academic to the rabbinic world, he had to change gear on that particular idea, and he had to go for readability and intelligibility, which he did fantastically well because he was a genius. But he still, in his book, sometimes uses words unaware of the fact that the general public don't use these words quite as much as he did. In this book called To Heal a Fractured World, otherwise, To Heal a Fractured World is a bit of a roundabout way of translating the phrase of Chazal, Tikkun HaOlam, healing the world, mending the world, making the world a better place. And chapter 10 is what we're going to be looking at this morning. Chapter 10 is called The Birth of Responsibility. That is the name of the chapter. And in this chapter, he goes through Sefer Bereishit. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of what he has in mind, and the way in which the whole Sefer Bereishit unfolds according to him. And I think you'll find it very, very fascinating. I haven't got so many texts to share with you. I'm going to start a little bit at the end, and then I'm going to go back to the beginning. I'm going to share a screen. Okay. Can you see the screen? Yes? Hello, can you see the text? Yes, good, thank you. It's always an act of emunah of mine that the screens actually pop up when I want them to pop up. So one of the most famous psukim about Avraham Avinu is the first pasuk in Lech Lecha, right? But I want to show you what Rabbi Sachs did with the first pasuk in Lech Lecha, using modern scholarship, using some of the range of his insight and scholarship generally, and how he, in a sense, brings out something which you would never have thought of in this first pasuk. What's the pasuk say? Vayom Hashem al Avram, God says to Avram Avinu, bear in mind, this is God's very first prophecy to Avram Avinu. Lech lecha me'artzecha, go forth from your land, leave behind your land. Umi moladtecha, and from your birthplace. Umi beis avicha, and from your father's house. El ha'oretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. So this is the first nevuah, and in terms of the 10 nisyonot, the 10 tests of Avraham Avinu, this is his first test. The first of the 10 was to pull up his roots and go. And where should you go to? Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't even tell him initially where he's going to. He just sends him in the general direction. El ha'oretz asher areka. Basically, it means when you get there, you'll know that you've arrived. You don't really know exactly what your destination is, but you know the direction, right? This is a general feature of many spiritual journeys that people make. One can't know what your absolute destination is going to be, but you have to know what direction to go in, right? It's a different it's a different principle to the principle of the GPS system, where you have to know your destination and then you can calculate the route. Here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you know, you've got to go, El Ha'oretz Asher Areka, the land that I will show you. It also has another subtle meaning to it, which means to the land where I will be seen, right? Where you'll come to a land, and in that land you will find that you will be able to see the presence of God more acutely. And indeed, in the very last, there's an interesting link up here, symmetry between the first of his 10 tests and the last pasuk of the last test of his, which was Akedas Yitzchak, the binding of Yitzchak, and the intention to sacrifice him, which of course didn't happen. But in the end, what does he say? He says, right, and now I know, he says, that this place where this Akedah has happened is Hashem Yireh. Hashem Yireh. Bahar Hashem Yeroeh. Which is very interesting. It's a play on words between Yireh, which means to see, and Yeroeh, which means to be seen. Right? It's Hifah, to be seen. Right? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Eretz Yisrael sees Kaviyachol, so to speak, more clearly. In other words, he's more engaged, and he can also be seen. Right? We can feel the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu more in the land of Israel, and particularly on the Har HaMoriah, which was, of course, the Har HaBayis. That is the Shara Shamayim. That is the place where HaKadosh Baruch Hu can see and be seen. And indeed, in the Gemara in Chagiga, there's a Masechta of Gemara which deals with the whole procedure of Aliyah L'Regel when you come Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. So there, the pasuk says, Yireh Yeroeh. The Gemara there makes an issue, halachic issue, out of this last pasuk of the Akedah. Says the Gemara there, Kashem Sheba Liros Kach Ba Leiros. That you're coming to the base of Mikdash to see and to be seen, right? And that all comes. So you have both in the first pasuk of the first test, you have Asher Areka, right? Where I will see you, or I will show you. You'll be able to engage with me. And the last pasuk of the last of the 10 tests, which is Hashem Yeroeh. Okay. Maybe a bit more about that at a later stage, but I want to get into what did Rabbi Sachs do with this pasuk. And this is, I would say this is typical of his ability to integrate modern scholarship with understanding of the Torah. I just want to make a line that he used quite frequently, was that when we read the Torah, we don't read it necessarily. We read it in addition to reading the words and reading the drushim and everything. You have to read the Torah covenantally. Now, this is also a word which maybe not everyone is particularly doesn't use quite so frequently. To read the Torah covenantally, Rabbi Sachs understood to mean that the Torah is actually talking to me, it's talking to you. It's not giving us ancient history. It's talking to every person at every stage of their life and history. And that is the covenant of the Torah, he writes, is the way in which the Torah speaks to us. And it has to be learned covenantally. That's what he is a line out of some of his talks. Okay, so what did he do with this? So bear in mind, the pasuk uses 3 descriptions for where Avraham has to leave. First is Artzacha, from the land. The second is Moladetecha, is your birthplace. And the third is Beis Avicha, from your father's house. Why didn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu just say to him, Lech lecha el ha'oretz asher areka, go to the land where I will show you? It doesn't matter what you're leaving behind. What's important is where you're going to. So the point here is, it seems to be that there's an important point being made on leaving these places behind. And the implication here is, the Malbim also says this, that there's a different, that Artzacha and Moladtecha and Beis Avicha, each of them has a different pull on a person. Artzacha is the land that you grew up in, and it's maybe part of your national identity. And Moladtecha is your place of birth, also, which is very close to you. And Beis Avicha, your family. All these need different, if you like, strengths to disengage from them in order to go on this spiritual journey. But let me show you what he writes. This is Rabbi Sachs. This abbreviation is simply my own abbreviation for the text, the name of the book, To Heal the Fractured World. THFW is To Heal a Fractured World. That is his book. So he says this opening instruction to Avram was a counter commentary to the three great determinisms of the modern world. Okay, let me explain to you a little bit what's going on here. So I did explain to you that actually the Telemalikin concept with which the Torah starts off human history is understood by many. The Meshech Chochmah, for example, goes to great length on this. What is the definition of the Telemalikin? So he says it is the ability of freedom of choice. The ability of a human being to be free to choose how to live and what to do. That is the nature. We saw other perushim on the word Telemalikin, if you remember, but the important issue for what we're looking at now is the idea of freedom of choice, that a person can choose the direction of their own life, can choose their actions, and is able to choose. What's interesting is that in many cultures and in many great thinkers in the secular world, they have insisted on determinism. Determinism is the denial of freedom of choice. Determinism means you have no freedom of choice, right? You think you have a freedom of choice. You imagine that you're free to choose, will I go out today, will I not go out today, will I eat this, will I eat that, will I go here, will I choose this career or that career? You imagine that it is, but it's an illusion. That's what is claimed by the determinists. In actual fact, if we were to know every detail about your life, we could predict with absolute certainty everything you will do in your life, because we are really determined, in other words, predetermined. That's the point. We are predetermined by various forces. There are forces acting on us which predetermine how we're going to live. And these views, this is incidentally, I've come across this in my rabbinic career on a few occasions with students of psychology. That students of psychology are taught in certain universities, in many universities, a deeper understanding of the psychological forces that are at play in the conscious, in the subconscious, in the brain chemistry, etc. And one of the problems, one of the type of a unique aspect of apicorsis, which one can easily get out of the study of psychology, is a denial of freedom of choice. People who study psychology at a great depth come to the false conclusion that actually there is no freedom, and that we're all just brain chemistry and hormones and reactions and genetic dispositions and various other forces are acting upon us, forcing us to do what we do, and that is a psychological determinism of the modern world. But there are different forms of determinism. And but the tzad hashava shebohen, the common feature of all determinism, is that there is no free will. And of course, the minute there is no free will, this radically affects our concept of morality. And let's have a look what Rabbi Sachs wrote about this. Of course, I've done it very, very briefly. So he says as follows: Karl Marx. So he's looking at the writings. Again, I've done it in just one or two sentences. Karl Marx, of course, was the founder of communism, certain types of socialism, and the USSR. The whole philosophy of Karl Marx claimed that the economics of the world drives everything. Everybody is really driven by materialism, and the materialism are the material incentives and deterrents which exist in this world. Many of them are very subtle. Many of them are based on the land and the value of land and property and gaining it and being thrown out from it and being a citizen of the land and owning the land and employing people to work your land. Right? All these things were features of the economy in the time of Karl Marx, and he claimed that there is no freedom of choice, because really we're kidding ourselves at a deeper level, sometimes conscious, sometimes subconscious. All our actions are based on economics and materialism. This is and therefore, of course, all the nations that based themselves on communism were atheistic. The USSR and modern China and all the other nations which adopted the communist ideology. Part of the communist ideology is atheistic and actually denies that we are actually accountable and morally able to do anything other than simply be affected by the economy. And therefore, what we need is a revolution to try and change the economics of the land. This is, of course, a major oversimplification and overgeneralization and quite unforgivable misrepresentation of Karl Marx. But from the point of view of what we want to understand, there's no question that Karl Marx taught a type of determinism which was rooted in his understanding of economics and materialism. And therefore, there is no freedom of choice. Spinoza claimed, right? Spinoza, probably arguably one of the most famous Jewish apikoresim of all time, the founding father of the Enlightenment, and was able to really is responsible for I don't know how many Jews during Enlightenment periods to leave Judaism. But he also claimed that actually the whole idea of mitzvahs and averos and the freedom of choice, right, is all an illusion, because human conduct is a result of instincts acquired at birth. At birth, he didn't yet know about genetics the way we know about it in the 21st century, but he understood that there was something about your context of your birthplace which affected dramatically your birth and your qualities and your attitudes and your abilities. And therefore, Spinoza is one of the most outspoken determinists among philosophers. There is no freedom of will. We are all a product of our birthplace. Freud, of course, famously claimed that all our actions are shaped by early experiences in childhood. That our early childhood experience, by the age of 3 or 4, Freud claimed, all our future responses and emotional life and values and everything are already predetermined. You think that you're making free choices, but it's all really hardwired into you from your early childhood experiences. Says Rabbi Sachs, Marx, Spinoza, and Freud, the 3 fathers of modern great determinism, are being addressed in this pasuk. You understand what I've written? In other words, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Avraham Avinu, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave behind your land, he means the land. And don't forget, in the ancient world, all of wealth and all of economy was land-based. It was the ownership of land, the development of land, which was at the heart of all the economy. There was no stock market, there were no banking, there was no trading. Everything was the agriculture for most of human history. That has been the case. So leave your land means leave behind your economic base, right? And Spinoza's claim of the birthplace being a determining feature, leave behind your birthplace, he says to Avraham Avinu, Moladatecha, and Beis Avicha, leave behind your father's house. So actually, this pasuk now, according to Rabbi Sachs, reads completely differently. He's saying to Avraham Avinu, what I want from you is the ability to raise yourself above all these deterministic features in the world. In other words, now the truth is that Marx, Freud, and Spinoza all had a certain amount of truth to them. It's absolutely true that economics is a factor in our decisions. It's true that genetics is a factor in our decisions. And it's true that early experiences of childhood are a factor. They claimed that not only were these factors, but that these were deterministic factors. In other words, these were inevitable factors. There is no freedom of choice to extricate yourself from these considerations. It's actually a very funny thing. You often find people who make great inventions and have great ideas, that once they get a great idea, that idea actually becomes the solution to all world's problems, right? The person who decides what great nutrition value there is in bananas will write a book telling you that bananas cures every known ailment of the human condition, and it has the most fantastic abilities. I read once that in China, they have an interesting saying along these lines. I think it's from China, which says, a man with a hammer thinks that everything is a nail, right? A man with a hammer thinks that everything is a nail means you've got one good idea, right? One good idea so Karl Marx's good idea was about economics. He had deep insights into how economics works, and therefore he concluded everything is economics. There is nothing besides economics, right? Freud discovered that early childhood experiences can be quite formative in the subconscious. And that is definitely true. But then he went from there to decide that therefore everything in life, every moment in your life, you are controlled by these forces. That is the hammer and the nail principle. So everyone has to be careful, right? That when you have a good idea, to keep it in perspective a little bit. But none of these three, and it's quite characteristic of great thinkers that they get carried away with their own great ideas. And therefore, when you read a book with a fantastically powerful idea in it, you have to be careful to sort of dial it down a little bit in order to put it into perspective. And Jonathan Sacks does that incredibly well throughout all his writings. He quotes sources. In other words, he quotes Marx and Freud and Spinoza and all these. In general, I must tell you that in the rabbinic world, all of us who came into contact with Rabbi Sacks were often incredibly jealous. I mean jealous, of course, in the kinat sofrim aspect of it. We're incredibly professionally jealous of his ability. He could sometimes read the most difficult books in psychology and philosophy and science, whatever it is, and he would sit down in one session, read the book once, and from then on, in the rest of his life, he could quote it and compare it and cite it. Like he had a search machine and a memory, and the man was an unbelievable genius, just an unbelievable genius, which of course is not fair. Once you're a genius, you are actually functioning at a different level completely. And most of his rabbinic colleagues, including myself, who are not gifted with that genius ability, have to work hard for our knowledge. And he somehow had a grasp of ideas and knowledge which was uncanny, nothing short of uncanny, and incredibly powerful. So he'd actually read all this stuff. I mean, he's now giving us just a potted version of it, but he'd read all this stuff. And then when he sat down to read the Chumash, and he read it, as I said, covenantally, he read it in terms of what does it mean to me. So when he read this pasuk, what does this pasuk mean to me? So he says, when it says, Lech me'atzecha moladecha beis avicha, it clearly is a reference to Marx, Spinoza, and Freud. I don't know whether any author has ever said that before. I don't know whether any author or any commentary on the Chumash, not that I'm aware of, has ever connected Marx, Spinoza, and Freud and determinism in general to this pasuk. But he does so in chapter 10 of this book very, very successfully. Of course, big picture, therefore, what this means is, if in fact this pasuk is telling him to rise above all the determining motivations and ideas of economics or of genetics or of early experiences to rise above all that. What really is being said here, and this is where we connect with the end of last week's shir, what really is being said to Avraham Avinu is, you are charged with exercising the Telemalikin in its fullest. If the Telemalikin is Bechira, is having freedom of choice to choose morally and spiritually your way in life, you are charged to really rid yourself of all these other influences which naturally affect everybody. Right? Economics and genetics, whatever it is, affects everybody. Nevertheless, Bechira can rise above that by engaging with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by engaging with an ultimate way of life and an ultimate value. One can go beyond all these other influences in life. And that's so he goes on to say in this pasuk, in this. Okay, so that's Avraham Avinu. Now, what I want to do is go backwards a little bit. That's an old Jewish way of learning Torah. You start at the end, and then you work your way backwards. I'm sure you come across that quite frequently. Torah learning generally does not progress in a linear way from question to answer. Anyone who learns a Daf Gemara knows that the Mishnah gives us the answer. And the Gemara wanted to know, if that's the answer, what was the question? In other words, we work backwards from answers to questions. It's a subject for a whole different share, but it's a very fascinating way to learn. You start with the answer, and then you analyze backwards. Where did the answer come from? Who said the answer? Are there any other answers? What was the question? Does this answer really deal with this question? Maybe it's an answer to a different question. That is really Talmudic logic in a nutshell. Anyhow, here we've got this particular, I think, a really beautiful and original Dvar Torah about the first pasuk in Lech Lecha, but it is much more interesting even than that. So let me give you a very brief, I want to give you a brief synopsis. I haven't brought you many texts today because I wanted to give you a sense of Rabbi Saks's ability for original parshanut. So the chapter 10 of this book, To Heal a Fractured World, is called The Birth of Responsibility. And what he does is he goes through 4 stages, similar to the 4 I looked at. If you remember, in the previous Shurim, I looked at the Dar HaMabul and the Dar HaFloga and the Dar Enosh, but he looks at, basically he says there are 4 stories. The first 11, the pasuk we just learned, incidentally, in the first pasuk to Avraham Avinu is chapter 12 of Bereishit. In the first 11 chapters of Bereishit, says Rabbi Sachs, there are 4 stories of people challenged to be responsible, and they fail. And they fail responsibility in different ways. And he wants to suggest that there are 4 different types of responsibility that a human being needs to develop. And these stories are stories of failure of responsibility, right? So I'm going to take you through it, and I want you to appreciate how the way in which these things are connected. And the point of this chapter is to explain that these 4 stories show how earlier generations totally failed a test, right? And that Avraham Avinu, and they provide the contrast, the gestalt, the background to explaining why Avraham Avinu was as unique as he was, because he goes through these 4 stages and he passes the tests. Okay, so that's really what he sees. So the first story is a story of Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava. I haven't brought you the text. I assume generally, I'm not going into great detail here with Mefarshim, but Rabbi Sachs focuses on one particular feature of the story of Adam and Chava. The fact that they're put in Gan Eden, fine. The fact that there was a tree they shouldn't eat, that's fine. The fact that they ate from it, that was well known, okay. But all that is not the point, Rabbi Sachs says. The point was that when Adam is challenged, you ate from the tree that I told you not to eat from, what did he say? For Rabbi Sachs, that was the crucial moment of the whole story. He said, it wasn't my fault. It was her fault. She made me do it, right? So Rabbi Sachs, that is the story. The story is about shirking personal responsibility. It's not my fault. Somebody else, let's find somebody else. In the world we live in today, we live in a world of what is sometimes referred to as a victimhood, right? Somebody commits a crime. No, it wasn't my fault. It was my environment. It was my background. It was a poverty. It was psychology. It was under pressure. To shift responsibility. Responsibility is a personal burden for many people that they can't bear. And many people are world experts at shifting responsibility. Whatever I did wrong, it's not my fault. Somebody else made me do it. Rabbi Sachs is very, very, very focuses like a laser focus on this idea, right? That this is really the key, a key idea in the whole Tanakh, right? Incidentally, the Gemara mentions this as the key difference between Shaul HaMelech and David HaMelech. There are many differences. Shaul HaMelech was first king, and then he was fired. Basically, he was demoted from king, and David took over. But both Shaul and David made lots of mistakes, right? The difference is when Shaul is confronted by Shmuel HaNavi and says, "Why did you not do what I told you to do?" Shaul says, "They made me do it. The people made me do it." The people wanted, right? The people wanted this to be somebody just texted me that apparently in this week's Torah Titbits, they've taken some parts out of this vort that I'm saying over. So in that sense, it's a chazara for those of you who are Torah Titbits avid readers. I certainly haven't seen it, but whereas David HaMelech also does things which he shouldn't have done, as soon as he's confronted with his misdeed, the first thing he says is chotasi. Chotasi. And that's why vidui is such an important feature of Jewish life. Saying chotasi or visi pashati. Chotasi means I take responsibility for what I did. That's what I did. It's mine. I did it, and I take responsibility for it. The story of Adam and Chava is shirking personal responsibility. Sure, I did something wrong, but it wasn't my fault. Somebody else made me do it. And then when Chava is asked why did she eat, she does the same thing. The snake made me do it. Somebody else made me do it. It was not my responsibility. Moving on to Cain. Cain kills, of course, Hevel. And when confronted with it, he doesn't say somebody else made me do it. So he doesn't shirk what he calls personal responsibility, but he shirks moral responsibility. Basically, Cain is saying, look, I can do whatever I want to do. I'm not my brother's keeper. I can do what I like. I've been given freedom of choice. I've been given certain powers, and I can do whatever I want to do. So Rabbi Sachs calls that not shirking personal responsibility, because he doesn't say it wasn't my fault. He says, it's not my moral responsibility to look after my brother. It just isn't. And that was the story of Cain. With Noach, right? So Noach is a more complicated story, but Noach starts off, interestingly, in the Torah. I mean, Noach remains for us one of the great tzaddikim in the Torah, but it's clear the Torah starts off describing Noach as Ish Tzaddik Tomim, as a great and righteous man. By the time you get to the end of the story, he's called Ish Ha'adama. Now, Ish Ha'adama in biblical language is not a compliment. Even the Adama is the land, there's nothing wrong with working the land, but to be called an Ish Ha'adama is not a compliment. It's the biblical equivalent of what Chazal called an Am Ha'oretz. Am Ha'oretz means somebody who's basically not just works the land, but is part of the land and has never raised himself up from being part of the land. So in actual fact, Noach ends up his life, and you know the story of him getting drunk and disgracing himself. He ends up being an embarrassment to his children, and Noach's story is a sad story. Says Rabbi Sachs, Noach didn't say it's not my fault, and he didn't say I'm not responsible, but he failed in what Rabbi Sachs calls collective responsibility. In other words, he didn't educate his generation. He didn't daven for his generation. He had no impact on his generation. He was perfectly responsible in his own private life, but he was responsible for himself, and he looked after himself and his family, and that was it. And he failed to have a larger impact, and that was the story of Noah. So here you first have personal responsibility, and then moral responsibility, and then collective responsibility. Okay, and then the fourth story is the Migdal Bovel for Rabbi Sachs, the Tower of Bovel. And that tower, we looked at it last week. I showed you the Har Mekdova on that tower, the Tower of Bovel. So he says that tower was the ultimate, what the Greeks call hubris, the ultimate expression of human arrogance and a denial of God. Why are we denying God? Because we're God. We don't need God. We have the power of technology, the power of the state, the power of human ability. We've got past this dependence on God. We're not denying. They weren't denying their responsibility personally or morally, but they were saying there is no God to whom we are accountable and answerable. We are the final authority in this world, a bit like sort of in the communist states, right? The communist lawgivers, they weren't answerable to anybody. The Stalins of this world and the Chinese leaders of this world, and they felt that they were the lawgivers, and they could decide life and death for millions of people if they decided that would advance the needs of the nation, and they were not answerable. It was absolute power, right? Brings corruption. Power corrupts. Well, how's that go? That statement by Lord Acton. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And that was Migdal Bovel, story according to Chazal, the story of Nimrod. Even though his name isn't mentioned in the story here, but according to Chazal, this was Nimrod. Rabbi Sachs here uses a more philosophical term, and he says this was not personal responsibility, moral or collective responsibility. This was what he calls ontological responsibility. I don't think he realizes that ontological is not in the vocabulary you usually use in your Shabbos table and with your shmooze to your children, but ontological means of the essence, right? In essence, there is a God to whom we are answerable, and this and Migdal Bovel was a denial of that principle. We are not answerable to anything beyond man, right? This was, in fact, the message of the so-called Enlightenment. In the 17 and 1800s, what was called the Enlightenment was a decision that man is only responsible to himself and responsible to other men, but there is no God to whom he's responsible at all, and that is ontological. So this says Rabbi Sachs, these are the four different levels. And it's a very fascinating conceptual commentary on Bereishit. So he says, first 11 chapters of Bereishit outline the failure pattern of human responsibility. Right? You first have Adam, failing personally. It's not my fault. Someone else made me do it. Right? How often do you hear that claim being made in our world today? People today have made a whole life style out of what is called victimhood. Being a victim means I'm a victim of circumstances, victim of my parents, victim of economics, victim of society, and therefore I'm not responsible. It's not my fault. I'm affected by other people, and therefore I'm a victim. Right? That was the first stage. Cain fails responsibility, moral responsibility. I can do what I like. Right? I'm not my brother's keeper. Noah fails collective responsibility. I look after myself and not after the world. And the Tower of Bovel is we answer to Noah. So this, says Rabbi Sachs, in chapter 10 of To Heal a Fractured World, takes us through the first 11 chapters. and the point of these stories is the story of Avram Avinu, right? So the call of Lech Lecho is a call to personal responsibility. So what I learned with you at the beginning of the Shia earlier on, this pasuk here, right, is the, if you like, the tikkun of Adam Harishon. The chait of Adam Harishon, which is, she made me do it. It's not my fault, right? Avram Avinu is being told, everything you do is your responsibility. Everything you do is your fault. Don't blame it on Artzacha or on Moladetecha or Mibeis Avicha. You're being asked to rise above all of these considerations and do something which expresses your Bechira, which expresses your Telemalikin, which expresses your spiritual essence. There's something which you believe to be right and you believe to be emes. And so the first thing Avram does is he makes a tikkun. This is the language of the Zohar, if you like. That the way Avram Avinu is metaken, is sort of mends the world. He mends all the, it's a phrase we use in our Oleinu, right? In Oleinu Shabbat, we say, Lesakein olam b'malchus shaddai, the tikkun ha'olam on a spiritual level. So Lech Lecha is a call to personal responsibility. Avram makes that decision, and he's his own man, uninfluenced by anyone else, right? Going into battle to save Lot, says Rabbi Sachs, shows his moral responsibility. In other words, the tikkun for the achet of Kayin, where Kayin says, Hashoma ochi onochi, right? Kayin famously denies any responsibility for his brother. Avram goes into battle to save his nephew, right? According to the Pasuk, Lot was not only his nephew, was also his brother-in-law, was Sarah's brother, but his nephew, Lot, had been captured. Avram Avinu goes into battle to save him. Why does he do so? The various reasons are suggested. I've given some shiurim on this. But the point that Rabbi Sachs makes is he does it in order to show that the mistake made by Kayin is not a mistake that he's going to make. The Hashomer Ochi Onochim, I'm my brother's keeper, is something which he wants to demonstrate that he has risen above that. Incidentally, in the Zohar is mentioned that the real tikkun of Kayin, of that terrible statement of am I my brother's keeper, wasn't actually Avraham Avinu, but it was Yehuda. When Yaakov Avinu says, how can I send Binyamin down to Egypt? If he gets killed, it'll be the end of my life. Yehuda says, Onochi a'arvenu miyodi tvaksheno. I will stake my life on the safety of Binyamin. I will give my life rather than see anything bad happen to Binyamin. Says that Zohar, that was a tikkun of Kayin saying, Hashoma ochi onochi. That Yehuda and Binyamin were linked together in such a way because Yehuda says that he was an Orev. An Orev is a guarantor. I'm personally guaranteeing the safety of my brother. But Sachs says quite rightly that actually the battle to save Lot was the beginnings of that moral responsibility. And then the accusation against Noach that he didn't daven for his generation. So Avram Avinu demonstrates collective responsibility by praying for Sodom, right? So he reverses that particular chait, that chait of that Noach had for ignoring in some way, for not being concerned, not believing that he can influence his generation. That was his. That was refuted by Avram Avinu, and then Akedas Yitzchak at the end of last week's parsha, right? That is the ultimate ontological responsibility. In other words, the ultimate recognition that the Devar Hashem, that the command from HaKadosh Baruch Hu is absolute, and that the human beings have a limited vision and a limited understanding of values and of the reality in which they are living, and that we are answerable to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In general, he says the word responsibility comes from the word response. Response means responding to a higher value, that we are not actually working out of our own needs and feelings and priorities, but we're responding to something higher. And that's the responsibility. So Odom, Kayin, Noach, and Migdal Bovel were the four denials of responsibility, says Rabbi Sachs, whereas Avraham Avinu takes them one by one. And in the story to see there is a parallelism, he claims, between the stories, the anecdotes that we find about Avraham Avinu, where each one of them is designed to, in some way, remedy the lack of responsibility shown by earlier generations. This is a bit of a different way of presenting Bereishit to what I did last week, but they're both true. They're not mutually exclusive. I emphasize the fact of Avraham as a teacher, that he invented, if you like, the idea of teaching. And it's very fascinating to see that throughout Torah literature, right, Torah is not meant to be learnt full stop. It's always lilmoid ulelamed. It's always to learn and to teach. To teach doesn't necessarily mean you're standing in front of a classroom or standing up in front of a community. Teaching means your friends, your family, your circle. Everybody has what to teach at some point in their life. And the ability and the knowledge of how to teach, teaching meaning to share values and ideas in such a way that to communicate them, that this is from the very beginning, right? The mitzvah of Talmud Torah is in Kriya Shema. So first, that the words of the Torah have to enter into your heart. And immediately, what's the next pasuk? You've got to teach them. You've got to teach them to whom? To anyone who wants to listen. Right? I think I mentioned to you before that when it says to teach it to your children, doesn't necessarily mean your biological children. Rashi there says something very fascinating. Rashi, have a look at Rashi on Vishinantam Levonecha B'dibarta Bom. Rashi says Vishinantam Levonecha means Talmidim. That's what doesn't mean your children at all. It means your disciples, meaning anyone who will accept from you an idea or a teaching. This is something which in every generation, there are circles of influence, circles of teaching. Avram was the first teacher. And because he was the first teacher, he started the first 2,000 years of Torah, which reached its peak at Sinai and later on in Yerushalayim in Eretz Yisrael. I hope I've given you a little bit of a taste of Rabbi Sachs's way of thinking. And Rabbi Sachs certainly, if you're ever bored and you're at home and you're not quite sure what to do, get onto YouTube, type in Rabbi Sachs and listen to one of his talks. And you will find that it's just, first of all, it's always a pleasure to listen to. Always a pleasure to listen to. And he sprinkles his Divrei Torah with some humor and anecdotes. And at the same time, he goes a little bit deeper into the ideas of Torah, deeper than most people do, because of his genius understanding. And certainly his presence will be greatly missed and mourned. And but Bez Hashem, we should all have Basuras Tevas and Klal Yisrael go further.